So welcome everybody. My name's Andrew Jack from the Financial Times. It's a great pleasure to see so many joining us today from UK schools, those who are interested in writing and reading about politics. The Financial Times, as you know, hopefully, and if you don't, you're welcome to sign up, but we offer full online access to our content, including much that's there about British and indeed global politics. So it's freely available to schools, to teachers and to students. And alongside our general coverage and our politics coverage, we arrange both for a number of selections of articles picked by politics teachers that they think are most relevant to the curriculum for A-level and IB and the other equivalent exam areas around politics. And we also organise a series of student competitions, including this, the third annual one with the Political Studies Association, as you know, because you entered, on how has coronavirus changed UK politics. So over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to hear from some great representatives, both members of Parliament and political journalist, my colleague George Parker, the FT's political editor, and two external experts on the political scene to discuss the subject of the blog. And then we're going to go on in about half an hour to announce the runners-up and the winners this year. But first of all, let me turn over to James Weinberg from the PSA and a lecturer at University of Sheffield to talk briefly about the PSA.
Thanks ever so much, Andrew, and welcome to everybody on the call. It's great to see so many of you joining us, and I, as one of the judges for this competition as well, I had the great pleasure of reading many of your entries, and I found them both informative and entertaining, so thank you if that includes you. Just to say a little bit about the PSA, because I'm sure that many of you are thinking of going on from your A-level studies to study politics at university. And if you do, then you might be interested in joining the PSA as an undergraduate member. Since 1950, the PSA has been promoting the development of political studies and the art and science of government and other branches of political science in the UK and beyond. And we're the largest learned society in the UK for those disciplines. As an undergraduate, if you become a member, we've got various events that you can get involved in through the year. We've got an undergraduate conference where you can present your own ideas and research and get feedback from both established academics and your peers. We've got journals that you can access for free once you're a member, and various seminars and webinars that take place throughout the year linked to various aspects of both undergraduate curricula and other topics, as well as a host of keynotes. So I hope that if you do go on to study politics, and even if you don't, you consider joining the PSA and getting involved in our community. But obviously today we're here to talk about this blog competition that the PSA is proud to co-host and co-sponsor with the FT. So I'll pass back to Andrew to kick us off and get this event going. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks very much, James. And I should say, alongside the FT and the PSA, both UK Parliament through its Education Office and the Association for Citizenship Teaching were also partnered with us on what we hope will be a really useful annual competition to engage sixth formers and to hear their views on political trends and themes. And obviously this year, coronavirus has been a huge structural influence, and one we want to explore over the next 20 minutes or so. I should say, unfortunately, that Simon Fell, who was a Conservative MP who is chair of the all-party parliamentary group on political literacy, had a little accident and so can't join us today. I'm hoping we'll shortly be joined by my colleague, George Parker, the political editor of the FT. But meanwhile, I'll briefly introduce you to our other panelists: Estelle Morris, Baroness Morris of Yardley, who's a Labour Party politician, a former MP for Birmingham Yardley, and at the time the Secretary of State for Education and Skills, now in the House of Lords. James Weinberg, who you just heard from, a lecturer in political behaviour at the University of Sheffield, an advisor also to the all-party parliamentary group on political literacy, and Sarah PICKARD, who's a senior lecturer in British Studies of Politics and Society at the University of Sorbonne in Paris, and a researcher on young people and political participation. And I'm delighted to see George, my colleague George Parker, has arrived on the scene. So George, I'll hand over to you to moderate and take part in this discussion with James, Sarah and Estelle. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Hope you can hear me okay. And just to say thank you very much for inviting me along and indeed to be one of the judges of the blog writing competition. It's been really enjoyable to read through all your entries. I think it was a really good question, but the answers were even better than that. And just over the next 20 minutes or so, we're just going to have a little discussion about some of the themes that you'll have touched on in your blogs, actually, and the question of, how's coronavirus changed politics? So I think everyone would agree it's changed politics in every conceivable way in the short term. What are the legacies of this pandemic in terms of the political landscape? So maybe I could turn to you, Estelle, first of all. I just wondered, in the first case, what do you think were the short-term changes that have been wreaked on the British political system by the pandemic?
Well, I'm hoping that start with a bit of optimism, George. I hope that everyone realises now that politics is important. I mean, anyone who's done canvassing for years knocks on doors and say it doesn't matter who you vote for. Nothing they do affects my life. And I think that's something that's short term, but might be interesting longer term, to work to see how the public's perception of the importance of politics and therefore how voting decreases or increases in future elections. I think secondly, it's about personality, but I think this will be short term. The pandemic came just after we'd had a general election with a new prime minister and a new leader of the opposition. And I think inevitably in the short term, how people see them and their ratings have been very much influenced by the pandemic. I'm genuinely not sure how long that will last. So if you take Brexit, I'm just not sure whether Boris Johnson will be written down in history as the Prime Minister in Brexit or the Prime Minister in the pandemic. And perhaps we need to wait a little bit longer before we know that. So I think that's the immediacy. But I do think that there's a number of other things, George. I don't know if you want me to just mention these now that I think will be with us longer term and are less about personality. And
Estelle, before you do that, well, I'll just ask the others about the short-term effects.
Sure,
I'll come back to your longer-term things. I think the longer-term things are indeed the more interesting things. I just wondered, James and Sarah, whether you have any reflections on how things have changed in the immediate term. James first.
Thanks, George. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I say, I would echo Estelle's point about the importance of politics for the everyday. And I'm hoping that many of my students have, have learned that lesson as well, studying through the pandemic. I think one of the biggest things we've seen was, the immediate aftermath of the 2019 general election was a kind of period of reflection, especially for the Labour Party, thinking about, well, electorally, how has the nation realigned itself post-Brexit, and what does Labour stand for? What's its identity going forward? And so that party was in a bit of a kind of existential crisis point, whereas the Conservatives had obviously made great gains in the north of England in the so-called Red Wall, and the pandemic almost provided a ready-made platform upon which to really have no choice about investing heavily in big social investment projects and social infrastructure, and to be a big state government, at least in the short term, in a way that would appeal to many of the voters in those constituencies that they'd won, but at the same time went against the grain for most Conservative governments looking back in history. So there's a definite change in the kind of electoral fortunes of our parties immediately. The Conservatives placed in a position where they were forced to kind of govern in a way that was unusual for them, but possibly beneficial electorally in the short term, and for Labour kind of losing a sense of what it stood for and what it could achieve within that picture.
So that's brilliant, James. Sarah, can I ask you for your short-term reflections, and particularly picking up on James's point about whether the pandemic, and this was a theme picked up in a lot of the blogs actually, whether the pandemic has changed the way the Conservatives in particular view the role of the state and big spending as well? Has the pandemic turned the Tories into a party of neo-Keynesians?
Well, I'm not sure I'm much of an expert on that, although I noticed in some of the blogs have mentioned that. But what's really struck me is that there's been more of an emphasis on things like, obviously, from the NHS. And looking, because I'm in France and I haven't been able to go back to Britain during the pandemic, is the how British population, but politicians are attaching themselves more to the NHS, and that's being expressed more. But also the way that politicians are talking about young people, and that the outlook and a way of discussing young people rather than saying that they're all like much more empathetic. That's really struck me in analysing politics from over here, and journalism too. So that's just maybe a that's come out of it.
Great, thanks. So just going back to you, Estelle, maybe like ask you to sort of come up with some of your longer term reflections on how things have changed. But do you think the pandemic has changed the nature of the way the Conservative Party views the state and public spending, and made life harder for in the process?
Yes, I do, but I was just thinking about what James said, and I'm sure he's right. It gave them a peg, but I think Boris Johnson would have done that anyway. I mean, given his levelling up agenda, I'm not sure it's any more than piling money into infrastructure in the red wall seats. Now, he wouldn't have done it to the extent, because we wouldn't have had as much spending in terms of the furlough expenditure and the rest of it. But I think that's a really interesting point. I would never say the pandemic helped anyone, but it gave him cover, if you like, for investing huge amounts of money in some areas of the country. But I think what's really interesting, he would have wanted to do it anyway, and he would have wanted to prioritise those areas at the expense of the south of England. So we'd have still had the problems you had in the Cheshire by-election. In a way, if you just think this, what would Theresa May have done? I think, you know, she'd have had to spend it, but it wouldn't have been part of her wider political strategy. So I agree with you, James, but I think there's a degree to which it would have happened anyway. So I think it has changed, and I think that's one of the big changes, is that it'll be a long time before people say, you know, governments shouldn't spend money, and there's no role for governments in spending the taxpayers' money. In actual fact, it puts Labour in a difficult position, or a different position, because they've always been the ones that have been associated with investment into disadvantaged areas, and just really that Keynesian approach to government. And in a way, they've had that stolen from under them. So how that plays out, I think, is going to be really interesting.
And James, maybe I can come back to you on this, because it seems to me that I agree with what Estelle was just saying. That it's probably pushed the Conservatives down a route they were already planning to go down. But the problem is, at the end of the pandemic, we've got a debt or deficit of over £300 billion. And suddenly you've got demands on catch-up spending for schools, the courts, the railways, across the board. The NHS, of course, social care. So the demands on the public exchequer are huge at a time when we already have a very high tax burden. So I wonder if that, in some respects, the pandemic has pushed the Tories down a path, but actually they're going to come up against some very tough public spending, public finances problems.
I think you're totally right, George, and as is Estelle. And I think there's a double whammy here, not least because, you know, massive spending now from a kind of prudent Keynesian perspective means that there'll be some need for demand management and budget management down the line. You know, the word austerity may not be something we assign to the history books just yet, but also the effect of Brexit as well is possibly going to mitigate some of the positive effects of the big investment now, and also mitigate the positive electoral returns that the Tories see from those investments, especially in key seats. I think the crunch point will be not only for me, not only the perspective that the Conservative government takes to domestic politics going forward, but also internationally. And I think here there's some real big questions to be answered, because we've seen Britain starting to look in on itself a bit more in recent years, and this crisis has shown that the kind of the domino effect of transboundary crises can occur very quickly. And I'm thinking about other challenges facing this government, and such as climate change. We know to some extent it's a pertinent known unknown that's hurtling down the track towards us, and the international community is fully aware of, you know, the global crisis that could accompany it, the things that it needs to do, the way in which nations need to cooperate together. So that for me is almost as big a question for the Conservative government. How does it marry that need to cooperate internationally and to look beyond our borders with the domestic politics of spending and investment and electoral gain?
Sarah, one of the things that a lot of the entrants in the competition referred to was the role of direct communication between politicians and the voters, which I think has been a real feature of this, and some of the huge viewing figures we've seen for some of the prime ministerial press conferences from Downing Street. Do you think that's going to? Do you think the pandemic will change the way that politicians talk to the public?
It'd be nice to see that politicians express themselves, well, first in front of the House, and they communicated more with the voters and potential voters, of course, and that they realise that this political communication should be two ways, that when you talk, you listen as well, because if it's only one-sided, that is not very beneficial. But I think obviously the Conservative government has adapted its strategy of communicating and gone to a more American way, and it's interesting seeing from France that the French government do it in a very different way. And so it would be nice to see also if politicians or government looked to see how things were done elsewhere and see what works, instead of what sometimes seems the case is that there's more, you know, inward looking and not outward looking to see not only how policies but communication and other things are done elsewhere as well. But yes, of course, communication is super important, and I hope that going forward that there will be more of an effort to reach out to, I would say, of course, young people, and to take on board their suggestions their voices are, who have suffered, I would argue, to the greatest degree during this pandemic.
Estelle, I just wondered whether you could just reflect a bit on how hard, or maybe not hard, it's been for Keir Starmer to do his job as leader of the opposition through this pandemic, because he's talked about the fact that the government's been buoyed by the vaccine bounce. He said that, you know, you've got to be constructive in your criticism of the government in a national emergency. I just wonder whether the fact that he's been constrained in the way he's been able to do his job over the last 18 months or whatever has left the party and Keir Starmer permanently damaged.
I hope not permanently damaged, and I don't believe so, but I think it's been difficult. Had he been leader for a number of years already and had built a relationship with the public, I think it would have been much easier for him. But as you'll have heard him say, he's never, until I think these last few weeks, made a speech to the public that's not been digital. So I think it has been hugely challenging. And he's right to say, we have this argument in the Labour peers group sometimes. It's right to say in times of a pandemic, look, we want to help you with this, we want to be supportive, we're all in this together. But the role of the opposition is to oppose. And even during times of crisis, you need an opposition that asks the difficult questions. And I think what we've seen, and it's a tension that's really difficult to work out, some of the time, especially at the start of the pandemic, I think Keir Starmer was being the leader that was supporting where he thought he should support. I think he's got pushed into being the voice of opposition. And sometimes in a way that's, you know, worth thinking about, they don't lie easily with each other. And I think now where we are, I feel the Labour Party is very much in that corner that says, I'm leader of the opposition. And that means that I ask the tough questions. Of course, what else has changed is that the Tories have now got a record in the pandemic. So in the first few weeks, the Tories, well, they had a record, but not one that was very well known. So I think it's been a challenge for him. I think it's put us on the back foot electorally. And I think it probably means if this is ever over and we get back to something in the way of doing politics that we had before, that we're going to have to do quite a bit of catching up, yes. I think he's making a start this summer, and I'm hopeful for that, but it's not been an easy start for him.
Thanks. And James, you were talking about the international dimension of the pandemic and how it's brought home the fact that we are obviously in a highly connected world these days, and you can't become little England. I just wondered what you thought the pandemic had told us about the future direction of devolution inside the UK, because what we've seen is a very strong incumbency benefit for whether it was Boris Johnson with the vaccine bounce, but also Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford in Wales. I just wonder whether you think it's going to strengthen the push for devolution or even independence in those countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly complex question. No easy answers, and I think I can start by maybe moving on from what Estelle said, about the difficulties facing Keir Starmer as well, because those in government during this crisis have benefited from unprecedented levels of digital political contact. And regardless of what you say, research shows that if you can see a politician and you're seeing them regularly, your trust and ability to kind of act positively towards them will increase. So, to some extent, opposition leaders like Keir Starmer have simply, they've lost out by not being in government at the right time to be in front of the camera every single day. So, in terms of controlling the narrative, controlling the morality play, so to speak, Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drakeford, they are pulling the strings of when and who and how can claim credit for things that go well and eschew blame for things that go badly. And they can be in front of the camera kind of making those arguments daily. And I think, the ideas about having the daily briefings in Downing Street going forward in the kind of US model, I think shows that the current Conservative government understands the benefits of having that daily political contact, having that face on the screen in a way that, means they're ever present. In terms of devolution, what that I think means is that for the first time in possibly the history of devolution post 99, you've got electorates in Scotland and Wales who feel properly connected to their leaders in the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Parliament, and understand to a much greater extent, if not fully, the powers that those leaders wield within those countries as well, and the ways in which those powers have been wielded in a different format from Westminster. And that in itself has built trust. We've seen, polling statistics throughout the pandemic showing that Mark Drakeford and Nicola Sturgeon poll much higher in terms of trust and confidence amongst Scottish and Welsh voters than Westminster leaders and Boris Johnson. So going forward, if either of those figures, either of those governments are to make a positive case for further devolution or independence, I think you'll have an electorate that is a much more of a captive audience, and that'll make that case a little bit more persuasive and much harder to defeat for unionist parties.
Brilliant, James. I can see there are a lot of questions coming in from our audience, which, Andrew, if it's okay with you, in a minute, I'll let you ask the questions because they're not actually coming up on my screen at the moment. So I'll leave that to you to ask questions. But before I do, I can ask Sarah, this is almost a sort of philosophical question, which is always a dangerous realm for political journalists to enter. But I'm interested in the way that the state has shown itself willing, by necessity, to intervene in the daily lives of the citizens across a whole spectrum of their lives, basically, who they see, who they have relationship with, all the rest of it. And I just wonder whether you thought that was going to have any lasting legacy on the British political scene. First of all, the state's willingness to intervene very directly in people's lives, and B, somewhat surprisingly, I think, the willingness of people to accept and actually do what they were told by the government.
Not everybody's doing what they're told. I've just seen some really striking, looking from France at some of the things that are going on in Britain. So not everybody agrees, but yeah, it strikes me as something very unusual that a particular Conservative government, anti-nanny state, is intervening in so many people's lives in such a way. It's different from France as well, as far as the rules and regulations have been much tighter in Britain than in France. And I'm very surprised at what I read about the extent to which people have been following them in Britain. And that I'm surprised also that there hasn't been more opposition to this intrusion into people's lives, or protection of people's lives as well. So it's been very interesting watching it and seeing, as I said before, the difference and the comparison to the way that Conservatives tended to not want to intervene in people's lives. Yeah, it's very
brilliant. So, Sarah, maybe I should just at this point hand you back to Andrew, because I know he's got some got some good questions coming in on the screen, and you can put them directly to the panel.
Thanks very much, George. So yeah, there's 2 or 3 questions which touch back on some of the themes people have raised earlier around particularly the role of Labour and the opposition. One here that he says that they've in the last 18 months had little to say and somewhat withered away. So can we expect a recovery in the months and years ahead? And somebody also says, did in fact Piers Morgan hold the government to account better than Keir Starmer during the pandemic? Estelle, maybe any thoughts?
Well, I have to plead guilty to not having listened or read about Piers Morgan, so I'm afraid won't address that bit of the comment. But no, look, it's not where I think the opposition has struggled is it's not been our agenda. We've not been, the part of the key thing in opposition is to shape the agenda so that people see you as an alternative government. And we've been in an entirely responsive mode in terms of the agenda has been the pandemic. But I don't know why anyone would say that there's been opposition. I mean, Andy Burnham, Labour Mayor, Metro Mayor in Manchester, the Mayor in Birmingham, Sadiq Khan in London, I think have really held the government to account in terms of the question that they've asked. And whatever issue you look at, whether it's been face masks, whether it's been how much the government did to protect those people in social care at the start, they have been aware that they've been being asked some difficult questions in Parliament. So I would say we've definitely not been able to seize the agenda in the way that we might have wished in opposition. But I certainly think that we've asked the questions and raised the issues, and in many instances reflecting what the public would want. So I would say if you think the opposition's not been asking questions, you're either kidding yourself or you've not quite understood how worried the government would have been at the questions they've been asked by the opposition and a whole range of commentators as well.
And James, you touched on this a little bit, but there's a question here. Would you say the pandemic has improved political engagement, such as through internet activism, or reduced it?
Ooh, so it's still too early really to have the data to answer that question fully. I think what we've seen is that, as Estelle said at the start, people are more aware of the extent to which politics encroaches on lots of different aspects of their daily lives. We have, for instance, as the person who put the question to us suggests, seen a massive upturn in political commentary online. We are entering an age in which digital democracy is being figured out, is being shaped, is being is becoming the norm. And the idea of expressing oneself online in a political manner, engaging in kind of boycotts and boycotts and petitions that are all organized online is something that has become much more prominent both before the pandemic and during it. And I think looking forward, I think that will continue for a while, because if we look at the last decade, whenever we've had major political crises or political events, there's been an upturn in, for instance, the number of people, young people, who go on to study politics at university. Myself as a lecturer in a politics department has benefited greatly from having an increasing number of students wanting to come and study in our department year on year. And that's entirely because of big moments like the financial crash, the coalition government, Brexit, and now the way in which governments have had to work during the pandemic. So even if the evidence isn't directly there at the moment, I think we can safely assume that the answer will be yes.
And Sarah, maybe, will we see the fiscally conservative electorate drifting away from the current Conservative Party? And if so, to where? Just as we're seeing traditional blue wall voters drift away from them as they become more socially liberal?
I was just thinking about what James was saying about political participation increasing during moments of political crises or big events, and that also there's more interest in politics because of more about identity politics and particular issues. So I think that we can also, because what's interesting in political participation is that those are still very important issues, especially to young people, despite or because of the pandemic and everything. And that it's not, and whilst all the discussion about health is kind of sidelined, issues are very, very important to young people, and that they see that they are political, and there's a more of a political awareness about how everyday things are political, also issues and things like that. So I think that that is definitely a greater interest in politics as well.
Thanks. So just a final question, maybe briefly back to Estelle, and George might like also then to wrap up and reflect on it. But what has the pandemic shown us about the relationship between politics and science? And could this lead to a greater push for the government to listen to science more on other areas, notably climate change? Estelle?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating question. I really do. There are too few scientists in Parliament. If you go through the backgrounds, they tend not to have degrees in science. And one of the things I found most fascinating is that we've heard the politicians say, well, we're relying on the science when we haven't. They may or may not have been relying on the science. And the scientists haven't, on the whole, played politics with that. They've kept steady to the way that they're working. So what I found most fascinating, it's like seeing parallel cultures being forced to work together. So you've got the politicians very good with words, but the words don't always reflect the facts. Then you've got the science, much better with facts, but don't always find the words to give that feeling of things changing. And this is a fact now, but it might not be a fact in the future. I think it's absolutely been fascinating. And I think it will have changed it, but also, won't it also have brought back that idea that politicians have to rely on experts? So maybe it's opened up that, that feature again to say that it's not just experts in science that are needed, but politicians will rely on experts in the non-Govian way in future as well. I think it's something that will have changed politics. I think it's one of the most interesting things that's happened during the pandemic. Is that my leader? Is that my leader? Hello, leader. Hi, Kit.
Your leader's just made a guest appearance.
I did very well for you arranged to come in at this point in the seminar. Lovely to see you.
I know. Listen, Estelle, and Keir, I was just telling Keir that the competition was answering, contestants were asking the question, has the pandemic changed politics? So I'm going to put Keir literally in the hot seat for 30 seconds just to tell you whether it has or not.
Estelle, nice to see you. How are you doing?
Nice to see you, Keir. Nice to see you.
Really good to see everyone. You've got lots of students on here, haven't you, for this session that's being run by the FT?
We have, yes.
Yeah, and the question is, how has the pandemic changed politics? And the answer is a lot, a huge amount, because certainly the way we've done politics here in Parliament has been challenged because, during a pandemic, I think everybody needs the government to succeed, and therefore it's a huge challenge for the opposition as to where we support the government, where we don't. But also just the fact that we've been doing politics at socially distanced, not being able to go out and meet people. It was quite, I don't know whether any of the people on the line today watched parliamentary questions, the PMQs today, but it was beginning to get back to a bit of normal. I can see other people now, or maybe I can see me. But what are the other answers that everybody's giving to the question?
Well, there's been a lot of questions. Lots of people answering the question saying that they thought it might push the Tories further down the route of Keynesianism, big spending, big state Keynesianism.
Well, see about that. I mean, Rishi Sunak may have something to say about that.
I was saying that it's pushing them down that route, but they've also run up against the fact they've run out of money, which could be a bit of a problem. A lot of people talk about the way the politicians are directly communicating more with the public. I don't know whether you think that's a good idea.
Well, using Zoom and Teams, etc. Yeah, I think there's more of that, but there's no. I personally still think there isn't any real substitute for being out with people if you're having a Q&A where you're having a conversation of any sort. You can only do so much on Zoom where you say, a bit like now, you say something, everybody else on mute, then they say something and everybody else goes on mute. It's not a real conversation. So the sooner we go back to the old way of doing politics in that sense, the better, I think.
Okay, that's pretty.
Brilliant.
You've got to do your rounds.
Nice to see everybody, and have a good summer. Thanks.
Take care.
Brilliant.
I'll take you into
the deliver Brexit poster as well.
Thanks very much, Keir, and to George Parker. Very a nice little extra addition to our panel today. George, thank you very much for that excellent extra guest introduction. Any final Any final thoughts you want to give? I mean, we were before Keir, we were just talking about science, and obviously we've got the build up to COP with the UK's hosting. I mean, do you think there will be any inspiration of science-led approaches that'll drive a different approach in the next months?
I think basically, despite the departure of Dominic Cummings from the government, a big advocate of science, I think everybody has realised they're going to have to get their heads around science, and we need probably more people with science degrees in government and slightly fewer PPEs students. I don't know, but I think no. I mean, everybody's after the pandemic. The next big thing will be the COP26 climate change summit in Glasgow in November. Everybody's talking about it now. Britain's got quite a good story to tell on that, actually, and it's a good opportunity for a bit of world leadership. But just say again, thank you very much to all the contestants. I mean, you gave some brilliant answers in your blogs, and the winners and the runners-up, and in fact everyone whose entries I read, they deserve great credit for the thinking you've done on it.
So George, thank you very much, and Estelle and James. I'm going to turn back over to Sarah to announce the runners-up and the winners. If any of you are shy, please don't be. If your name's called, or indeed if you're willing, just very briefly to put your cameras on, just so we can see your face and capture the pleasure of the winners, that would be much appreciated. So do please briefly turn on your cameras now. And let me turn over to Sarah to announce the findings of the judges from our competition for this year.
Thank you. So just a quick word. So the judges were Dr. James Weinberg, who's here, he's a trustee of the PSA, a former school teacher, and now he teaches politics at the University of Sheffield. George Parker, who we've just been hearing from, political editor at the Financial Times. We hear him on the Radio 4 Week in Westminster. And Scott Harrison, who's a trustee at the Association of Citizenship Training. So these are the comments. They're not my comments. These are the comments from the judges. So first of all the entries were judged anonymously to ensure, secrecy and meritocratic process. And here are the overall comments from the judges. So students did a remarkable job analysing the impact of the coronavirus pandemic in the UK politics within the constraints of just a 600-word blog. Entrants engaged with a range of aspects of political life that were affected by the pandemic, not least civil liberties, economic policy, political communication strategies, foreign relations, and party popularity, as we've just been hearing about. Where entrants tried to engage with too many of these topics, their blogs were often characterised by an impressive breadth as to one element followed another, but equally a lack of depth or scope to argue something with nuance and detail. In other words, spreading themselves a bit too thinly, maybe. The strongest entries broke away from this conventional and broad form of analysis and instead used the blog to provide a well-argued and focused opinion piece to inform, educate, and entertain. These responses were more than thematic and allowed entrants to develop original arguments in response to the question posed. So without further ado, stopping the suspense. So I'm going to announce first of all who came in third place. So this blog, and these are the comments from the judges, this blog does a good job of looking at how the pandemic has changed political life across the board, from the efficacy and risk attached to social interventions, such as recurrent lockdowns, the importance of direct daily political communication between government and governed, and the ways in which the pandemic fueled the UK's fractious post-Brexit relationship. I just said breakfast, didn't I? I did it. Post-Brexit relationship with the EU. This blog is well written, and the entrant does an excellent job of combining journalistic flair with an educational and informative approach to political commentary. Overall, this is a highly commendable blog that is deserving of third place in this year's competition. And so that is Henry Worrall. Well done, Henry.
Thank you.
Congratulations. You should be very pleased. There were many entries. So round of applause. I think I'll clap. All right. So I'm going to move on to second place, and then maybe we'll come back to you. So this student writes with a confident authorial voice and a natural journalistic flair. A number of bigger hooks related to Conservative economic policy, Labour's electoral fortunes, and the relevance of devolution are developed with nuance and a range of illustrative examples. The blog looks, for example, at the pandemic's role in shaping conservative Keynesism, with a nice turn of phrase about the interlinks between nationalism and nationalisation. And it is particularly good at highlighting the underlying political problems that will remain long after the guns fall silent, quote, and the pandemic recedes into our collective memory. In keeping with the medium, this blog is entertaining and argumentative whilst retaining an informative function. An excellent submission with a worthy runner-up of this year's competition, and that is Joseph Manley. Hello, Joseph.
Hello, thank you so much. That's amazing.
I wish we could all hear everybody's applause. Well done to you. Congratulations. And so, first but not last, if I get this right, excuse me, I will talk about the winner of this year's competition. So the winning blog focused throughout on government borrowing, with the pandemic placed at the centre of a most dramatic change in conservative economic policy. Here it is argued coronavirus was not the problem, but the solution to a problem posed by the failure of austerity and the impact of Brexit on voting patterns. Simply put, when asked, what can the Conservative Party do to retain red wall seats and level up, the pandemic provided the answer. The blog was brave in pursuing this thematic approach, well researched in establishing the longer and short-term historical context, logical in the development of the argument, lively and even provocative, I think we can all agree, in the choice of words, and compelling in coming to a conclusion. So very well done to Nikolas Boyd-Carpenter. Nikolas?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well done. Great read, according to the judges, and I agree.
Thank you. It's a surprise.
So, Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Congratulations to our two runners-up and our winner, Nikolas. Really interesting essays. And thanks also to all of the rest of you, both the long list and all others who entered our competition. Some really excellent insights, and we'd encourage you to continue to engage and think and write about politics as well as other issues. And we wish you well in your further studies, next stages in life, and equally do spread the word and encourage others to enter for our next round of competitions and to engage more widely with journalism, with the PSA, with the FT and beyond in the pursuit of your researches, studies and interests as citizens. So it remains for me to thank George, Estelle, James and Sarah for their role also on the panel, our judges, to thank the PSA as well as the Association of Citizenship Teaching and the UK Parliament for their support. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the coming holidays.